Hi, I'm Patrick Manning at Black Desert Resort. We are proud sponsors of Beyond the Game. I recognize that wins aren't always measured by points. Scoreboards don't always define champions, but the story this athlete has to tell, it does. This is why Black Desert Golf Course is proud to sponsor Beyond the Game to share this inspiring story with you. Please enjoy.
You're listening to the Utah Checkdown podcast. And now your host, Josh Furlong.
Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown podcast. I am Josh Furlong. As always, I am happy to be back. It's great to be able to be talking football. And we are 8 days, if you're listening to this on Wednesday, 8 days away from kickoff. So next week, this is going to be a podcast that talks about football playing in that week. You'll get to see Utah playing against Southern Utah. So it'll be an in-state game. Excited for that. I think there's a lot of intrigue, even just for this game. Most FCS games aren't, but I think there's some intrigue, and we can talk about that in a minute. But before we do that, let's start off talking about our partners, Black Desert, who are helping with the KSL.com Beyond the Game video series. The videos highlight various athletes and give an inside look into their life. Recently, we talked with former Utah offensive lineman Garrett Bowles about how a second chance at life allowed him to pay it forward to troubled youth. You can check out that video and many others on KSL.com. Black Desert is a new resort destination in St. George that features a championship Tom Weiskopf 19-hole golf course that combines a private club feel with destination resort golf amid lava fields and 360-degree vistas. Black Desert is changing entertainment in southern Utah, and they're just beginning. Black Desert, where remarkable is within reach, home of the Black Desert Championship PGA Tour. All right, that PGA Tour will actually be pretty fun. I'm excited to see how that comes to fruition here in Utah and all that takes place there. So that'll be fun. But this is a football podcast. We're talking football right now. So before we jump into some fall camp stuff, and with fall camp, it's essentially over. It's now business season, right? Utah is taking care of business in preparing for teams. And so we'll talk about some of that stuff. But first, I want to kind of update on a few little things that have happened since last week. First off, today, the Senior Bowl watch list was released, and normally this isn't a huge thing. This is more just a projection of talent in terms of going to the next level, right? So this is usually the Senior Bowl, who is considered one of the top kind of destinations for a lot of these athletes that are going to be more high draft picks or guys that are projected to do well in the NFL. By all means, it's not a predictor of it, but it is a good indication of kind of how these players are projected. Utah leads the Big 12 with 13 selections. That's pretty remarkable for Utah. That shows how much talent or potential NFL talent this team can have. And so you're seeing why maybe Utah's the favorite in the Big 12, right? They've got a lot of veteran talent. They've got a lot of guys that are projected to take it to the next level and move forward there. There's some guys on there, at Utah that probably won't see the NFL or might be a practice squad guy, and that is perfectly fine. Look, if I could, go get paid to make it on the practice squad, I still think that would be a remarkable feat. You got to say you played in the NFL. It's a great opportunity. So there's nothing to knock there. It's a great opportunity. And like I said, Utah leads the Big 12 with that. Out of those 16 teams, Arizona, Colorado, and UCF, they each had 11 selections. ASU and Kansas had 10, and then Texas Tech at 9. There's a whole bunch after that, obviously, with those teams. Kansas State and Oklahoma State at 6 apiece. A little surprising. They're kind of younger in some respects, even though Oklahoma State has a veteran unit, especially on the offensive line, that is considered one of the best in the league. They're coming back. So just an interesting situation there. This is, once again, this has no indication on how the talent will work on the field for the college football season, but at least it's just a predictor of kind of how talent evaluators are looking at these teams and kind of what's going on there. So I don't want to get too far in the weeds with that. That's all it is. Just kind of update you on that. But it is still an interesting feat for Utah to be able to have that. If I if I remember right, I think looking at it, Ole Miss has the most selections in all the country, and I think they have 21. But that shows kind of how good this Ole Miss team could be, and to have that many in the SEC kind of shows where they're at. So just kind of some fun stuff. Also, with that recruiting update, we don't generally do a ton of recruiting on this podcast, but we get into it occasionally. Last week, you had Yosei Epinesa. He's a defensive lineman. He was that 5-star defensive lineman that had Utah as one of his top 5. He ended up staying home and picking Iowa. It's a family school. It's a big school for them, and so that was always going to be a tough sell for Utah to try to get him away. But Utah made some inroads and absolutely was in contention. Depending on who you talk to, it sounded like it was down to Iowa and Utah. There was a really strong connection here for Epinesa. So, good battle. The fact that Utah is able to bring in a 5-star kid and be able to battle for him down to the end says good things about what this coaching staff has been able to do in the recruiting front. So, hopefully for Utah's sake, they want to be able to have more of that. And I think, if you can continue to win, you get some of those battles and maybe some of them flip your way. I think if many of you remember, you watch some of these hat shows, right, where these kids are declaring their things and, they'll pretend to take the Utah hat and fake them out and then go choose like a USC or Georgia or Ohio State. That's starting to flip a little bit for Utah. You're starting to get some of those fake outs with another school and then putting on a Utah hat, and so it's taking some time. But Kyle Whittingham has always said, recruiting is the lifeblood. He's going to continue to do that. Now you mix in the transfer portal. There's some of that stuff. But another 5-star player that Utah is heavily after and one that they are going probably the hardest out of anybody is Jerome Miles. He put Utah in his top 5 recently, announced a October 30th commitment date. His top 5 include Ohio State, Georgia, Texas A&M, and USC. Obviously big names to be a part of. My understanding is that he will try to do an official visit to Ohio State this year, probably, I would assume before that October 30th date. And so, obviously wide receiver and Ohio State go hand in hand, but at Ohio State, Jerome would be, one of many. And that's not to say that's a bad thing. Obviously, Ohio State has done a tremendous job at developing talent. There's a lot of those guys that move on to the league. So it really is going to come down to what he wants. There's been, there was a lot of talk about him being a silent commit to Utah before he made that Ole Miss commitment. He's backed off from that commitment and doesn't even have him in his top 5 now. So we'll see how that goes. I think Utah is trending very well here. He's not necessarily shy about talking about these things. I mean, he talked about how he wants Utah to really spread the ball around and show that they can be a passing team for him to want to commit there. So I think if Utah can do what many expect them to do, where the passing game becomes much more prevalent in the game, this becomes a much, I don't want to call it easy, right? But I think it becomes an easier situation for Jerome Miles to want to commit to Utah. So we'll keep up on that, but I wanted to update on that. There are a few crystal balls and projections from 24/7 Sports and On3. You've got Greg Biggins and Steve Wiltfong, both guys on different respective brands that have projected him coming to Utah. But there's still, almost 2 months till this date. So, there is 2 months to this date. So there's still some time. And, if he takes that Ohio State visit, anything can change. But what I've heard is that he is, trending very well toward Utah. So it's not something that's a done deal. I can't imagine, but it's something that Utah is going to be heavily working and recruiting on. And if he were to sign with Utah, that would be Utah's highest rated recruit. It would be their first 5-star players. So that bodes well. Miles is one of the top receivers in all of the country. If I remember right, he's like 5th or 6th, top 30 player overall. This is a kid that, would absolutely boost Utah's recruiting rankings as well as everything else related to that. So an interesting situation there. And then recently, looking at 2026, so a year out, 3-star QB Brady Palmer, he's out in San Diego. He recently got some love and some crystal balls heading toward his way as well. My understanding is he will take a visit to Utah this year. He's got a lot to still come out there and show, and there's a lot of great offers out there. Auburn, Ohio State, TCU, USC is just some of them that he's got that he's interested in. But So far, it seems like Utah is well on their way to trying to find their next quarterback, and that's become a priority for Utah to get those quarterbacks early in the recruiting classes and then kind of fill out the class after that. I feel like once they get that recruiting class done or the QB commit done, then Utah feels comfortable kind of doing whatever they can to round out that class. For example, the 2025 class, Wyatt Becker, they signed him or committed to him. He committed to Utah pretty early. It was last year actually, and so he's remained committed and has stayed true to that and is expected to enroll at Utah next year. So Utah is continually doing what they can there and will continue to round out that. So that's it for recruiting, but just wanted to update on that. Those are obviously some big names to kind of focus on and something to pay attention to. But we have football coming, and that's the name of the game. Utah has wrapped up fall camp, and by wrapping up fall camp, it's more they're done looking for those position battles for the most part. They're done, installing offense, installing defense, looking at the different things. There's a lot of that stuff that will continue throughout the season, right? Like there's still some things that you're going to fix and things that you may not perform well in the game, and they've got to do. That's what practice is for, right? But now it's shifting completely to in-season mode. They're now focusing on opponents. They're going to be scouting, SUU. I'd have to imagine they're scouting Baylor and some of these other schools right now and making sure that they're all ready for that. I may have previously mentioned this, that, this is the first year where, Andy Ludwig had said they came in February and looked at Big 12 teams and scouted them and really kind of tried to do a dive on who they are, what their defenses are, what their offenses are, so they don't get surprised. And then in June came back and did an even deeper dive to kind of give themselves a better understanding of it. Obviously, it's different when you see them in person, so I'm curious to see how that kind of comes to shape when you face they've played Baylor, so they've got a little bit on them. But when you face Oklahoma State on the road, what have you seen on tape? How does that translate? And will it be the same in person? Those are going to be the questions that are there. But by all accounts, now this is a team that has a good understanding of everything. There's gonna be more as each week goes on, but you've got them focusing on that. Now, with next week comes Southern Utah, and traditionally I'd say an FCS game is kind of one of those that a lot of people gloss over and overlook, and there's still going to be a lot of that because it's non-conference schedule, and people are going to probably come to the game and maybe leave early, especially if Utah gets up large, and whatever that how you want to fan, that's up to you. But to me personally, I think this is going to be one of those games that there's far more intrigue into than maybe in years past, right? Like Utah has played Weber State, they've played Southern Utah, they've played these other schools, these FCS schools, and there really isn't anything other than just this being a tune-up game, getting ready for the season, and that is still this game, right? I don't think many are predicting SUU to really be competitive in this game. They expect Utah to be pretty vanilla in what they're doing, not throwing out anything too crazy. You don't want to give everything up, but to me, this is the time where you get to see Cam Rising back, right? You saw him in spring, and that's great, and it's a glorified scrimmage, but you now get an opportunity to see him back on the field. You want to see him and how he performs. You want to see him get out of that game early so that, Isaac Wilson is in there. Maybe some other quarterbacks get in there. You want to see those 2-3 depth guys coming in there and having some more playing time, especially in that second half. So that's the natural thing, but you've got so many players that are coming back from injury that bring intrigue that I think that gets fans excited. I think you're also adding so many different players from the transfer portal, a Dorian Singer, Damian Alford. You also get Caleb Lohner from the transfer portal, who was completely different sport. What does he look like? I think there's just so much intrigue into this game that it makes it maybe even more exciting than maybe years past when you're playing an FCS opponent. Now, I'm undoubtedly Utah's going to go 3-0 on one series, and fans are going to be frustrated and say, "I thought this offense was going to be good." I'm expecting it, right? Maybe they don't. Maybe they run like a well-oiled machine and everything works well. But I think sometimes you have to temper expectations a bit and realize that it's still going to take time. These are real games. They've been practicing. They've been in scrimmage settings, but haven't necessarily been in a full game setting where guys are live and guys are coming at you. Cam Rising, does he take a hit in this game? How does he respond? Brant Keithy, same matter. There's a lot of these different things where you want this game. It's different than Florida, obviously, where you're not ramping up to this huge high-level opponent that's going to be incredibly physical, that's going to take a lot of your effort and energy to be able to get out of it. You're now focusing on an opponent that, by all accounts, you should be able to handle fairly easily. How that game shakes out will be interesting, but I'm excited for it, right? I always love the beginning of college football season. I think there's something, I don't want to call it magical, but as it's like a kid on Christmas, right? Like, you're excited to be able to have that. It brings the sport back, whether you're a fan of the Utes or not. I think football is back, and if you're excited for football, that's just an exciting time. So I think there's a lot of intrigue, and we'll talk a little bit more about Southern Utah and hopefully bring in some guests. I was hoping to have a guest this week, but it hasn't worked out yet. To be able to talk about Utah as well as to preview the season and kind of what's going on. So that's where we're at. But let's recap a little bit of fall camp. Last week, we finally got to talk again to the coaches, the assistant coaches, the position coaches, and kind of get their take on their players. We talked to them at the beginning of fall camp to be able to get an understanding of what they're looking for as they're going into fall camp. Now we got to look at what transpired, right? How did those two scrimmages go? How did their players look? What are the position battles looking like? So we'll try to break down some of that. We're not going to go over every single position because there's just too much, and that would take forever. But by and large, this is a team that feels very comfortable with where they're at. I don't want to get, I don't want to speak for Utah, but I also don't want to say that, this is a team that they feel really confident. I'll say that. Like, this seems to be one of the most confident teams. They feel like they know what they can do on offense. They feel like they know what they can do on defense. They have tremendous talent in pretty much every single position. There's depth. There's a lot of talent out there. It's just a matter of, can it produce on the field, right? You've got so many guys out there that can do it, and you can project them and say, oh, you're this. Oh, you have 13 players on the Senior Bowl watch list. That's great. Now go do it on the field. And you're getting that message from the coaches, right? You're getting them saying, I want to see it on tape. And there's a lot of guys that have proven that. But there's still a lot of that. You're going to see a lot of that in the secondary of guys moving around and shifting a little bit and needing to be a little bit more experienced to be able to get full trust in the coaching staff. So, but let's start with Andy Ludwig. Ludwig said that he is very confident in the trajectory of this offense. He's very similar to Kyle Whittingham in that he doesn't like to give early praise unless he feels like it's merited. He's not going to stick his neck out there to say, oh, this offense is great, and then you come out there and they can't move the ball. This is a guy that is very calculated in how he approaches things, how he talks about things, and he's feeling confident. And so you have to take him at face value, knowing that they're pretty honest with this, right? As a media member who doesn't get to watch practice, I have to take him for his word. That's the best that I can get, right? I would love to be able to be out there and even see just 20 minutes of practice to kind of get a vibe and get a sense of how things are going. Unfortunately, we don't get to do that anymore. So we just kind of have to take them. I think based on him not really saying a lot of that kind of stuff last year, or in some years where they don't feel like their offense is right where it needs to be, this is a good thing for Utah, right? And I don't think that's a surprise. I think Utah, there's been a lot of talk about this offense and what it could mean and the depth and the talent all around. That running back room is stacked. You've got tight ends stacked. You've got wide receivers stacked. The offensive line is veteran, and they've got a good unit there. How does this all look? That, I think, shouldn't come as a surprise, and so I think it's a matter of really just tempering those expectations to a point that it's not going to hurt Utah. Utah has to now live as the top dog. They have to have the understanding that everybody's coming after them. And if that offense doesn't have that firepower and it's not able to live up to those expectations, this becomes a long season. Yeah, you still have your defense, and you have to imagine that Utah's defense will still continue to produce at a high level and create havoc plays and be those ball hawks that they like to talk about. But you need a competitive offense. And I think with Cam Rising under center, and they believe Isaac Wilson as his backup, does that for them. So we'll see. That's the interesting thing that we'll get to see that we're most excited for, right? I don't know that you're going to get all of that against an FCS opponent because, potentially they should look great against an FCS opponent. And if they don't, I don't know that that's indicative of it either, but, it could mean something. We'll see. But as part of that, he also talked about how he expects this team to be, quote, very dynamic in the red zone. This has been a trouble for Utah in some respects. I mean, it hasn't always been bad, right? I think Utah does well at scoring in the red zone, but some years it's more field goals, right? Some years it is more touchdowns. But I was curious about that and kind of looked at it. You look at 2023, so last year, Utah they didn't really get into the red zone a ton comparatively. They had 48 red zone trips and they scored on 39. But the problem was 51% of that were only touchdowns. So the majority of that, so that 81.3% of the times that you get into the red zone and you score, there was a significant amount of that were field goals. That's not a surprise to anybody that watched last season. Utah did score, right? They got their touchdowns 51% of the time. They got a touchdown, but at the same time, it wasn't to those numbers that they would like. So comparing that to Cam's 2 years that he was the starter, you look at 2022, 2021, they're the exact same essentially. The Utes scored 83.6% of the time when they got in the red zone. Ironically enough, both seasons, they got into the red zone 73 times. And of those 73 times, they scored exactly 61 times both seasons. I had to look this up twice to make sure that I wasn't just like looking at the same year and putting those same numbers. They did the exact same amount. The slightest difference was in 2022, Utah scored 1%. Well, actually, it's 1.5% more touchdowns than they did field goals. So, this is an offense that can do a lot. It's still not perfect. I think Utah would love to be able to have that a little higher. You want to be able to get closer to that 90 range where every time you get into the red zone, you're scoring. If that's where they're at, I mean, this is a team that's going to be offensively top 5 probably in terms of red zone offense. So if you can get to that level, that does a lot for Utah. Some other seasons, 2019 obviously was a good year for Utah. They were talked about going to the playoffs. They scored 85.5%, had a 67.3 percentage for touchdowns on 55 trips. 2018 was pretty wild. They had the highest, so they were ranked 16th in the country at 89.8%, but they only scored 57.1% of theirs as touchdowns. So a majority of those did come, not majority, but you get the point. A lot of those came as field goals. So not a great sign. Utah obviously did well in 2018, but they weren't that team that they were in 2019. And it's only continued to grow in 21 and 22. 23 is kind of that anomaly where things didn't really work well for Utah. So if he feels like they're dynamic in the red zone, that bodes well for Utah. I think you've got a lot of talent there where you have 9,000, players that you can throw the ball to, and many of them are much bigger, taller, stronger, more physical than what Utah's had in years past. So if they can scheme it up in a way that they can kind of utilize that talent, you have to believe that Utah can be dynamic in the red zone. But once again, until it actually happens, we'll kind of remain cautiously optimistic about what that is. So another area where Ludwig talked about is Cam Rising rust, right? Like we've all kind of just given that Rising is going to be good, he's going to be back to his normal self, and that everything is going to be great. And there's a very high likelihood that could be the case. But even Rising talked about he's needing to shake off the rust, right? He hasn't been in a full setting where he is the number one guy. He's taking those number one reps, and he is going through the game in a game-like setting. Yeah, he hasn't been tackled yet, and they're not going to do that in practice. So he has to kind of learn all those things, and there comes some rust with that. At least that's what he said, right? So I asked Andy Ludwig about that, and I really loved his response. So I'm just gonna play that for you, and we'll kind of go from there. Cam's talked about just needing to shake off some of that rust, just having not played for a year. How have you seen him develop in this fall camp, knowing that you've kind of preserved him a little bit?
Yeah, he's if there's rust, sometimes we talk about hey, Cam, if you make a mistake, there's probably 3 people in the world that know it, me, you, and your dad, okay? He's going to make it right. So if there was a little rust earlier, I see that getting polished up very, very much so. It's all going to be a matter about, taking that first hit, which we'd all like to avoid, but it's a contact sport, collision sport. See how he reacts to that and move on. But I'm not seeing the rust. There's no rust.
There's no rust. Andy Ludwig likes what he sees from Cam Rising. And I don't think that's just him, trying to blow smoke up and and try to let everybody kind of believe in who Cam can be. I genuinely believe that. I think you saw a lot of that in spring, in that spring game, where Cam, you're playing a vanilla defense. You're not doing anything too crazy, and he was able to dice it up. Obviously he and Dorian Singer had a great connection in that spring game, and so you were able to see a lot of that. But I think this is a guy that's ready to go. He's healthy, at least by all accounts. There's probably nagging things that are still going on. I don't think, as you get older, I can attest to this. I woke up without doing anything and somehow pulled my hamstring. So I asked my wife if she was beating me in my sleep, and she said no, but I'm not sure if I believe. No, I'm just kidding. But I think you just get old and things happen, right? So that's not an indication of Cam being an old player. I know I'm tired of that kind of that stuff, but it's just the nature of getting older. Maybe things aren't always perfect. So, like I said, though, by all accounts, you have to assume that Rising is fully healthy. They feel confident in who he is, what he's got, the way that he's able to diagnose the defenses and really just understand what they're doing. Sometimes, before anybody else does, he's really good at being able to do that, and we're going to see what happens. So with that, I kind of wanted to look at some realistic expectations for Rising. His last year, playing in 2020, he threw for just over 3,000 yards, 3,034 yards. He had 26 touchdowns, 8 interceptions, had a 65% completion rate almost. He was passing for about 233 yards per game. That's honestly the most, in a long time for many quarterbacks at Utah. Those were great numbers. But can he do more, right? I was kind of curious to see Utah's numbers on this. 2021, he threw for 2,500 yards, but obviously didn't start the entire season. 20 touchdowns, 5 interceptions, 64% completion percentage. But Rising is already near the top of all these statistical categories in terms of what he's able to do. Huntley, he was the last one to throw over 3,000 yards. It was 3,092 yards in 2019. You had Jordan Wynn. The most he did was 2,300. You had some other players. Sorry, I'm blanking on some of the others. There just really hasn't been a ton over time that have really gotten to that mark. And so in my head, is 3,500 passing yards a high expectation for Cam? Is it too low of an expectation? I think if you're asking a lot of people, they have the expectation that 3,500 yards is kind of that middle number, right? If he can do it at 3,000 yards in 2022 and has even more talent, in the wide receiver room and the tight end room, is 3,500 yards good enough? And if he's throwing for over 3,500 yards, that puts him likely in kind of the upper echelon of quarterbacks. It's never going to compete with those teams that run the air raid or they're just really pass heavy. But at the same time, if he can get into that upper echelon of passing numbers, what does that do for Utah, right? Is their ground game still potent? If it is, and he's still able to produce those numbers, this is a very dynamic Utah team, right? And then they are probably able to get to wherever they need to go. But I was curious about that. In Utah history, only 2 quarterbacks have thrown for over 3,500 yards. Mike McCoy in 1993 threw for 3,800 yards. And then Scott Mitchell, obviously, is the record holder in 1988, threw for 4,300 yards. That's it. Those are the only 2 times. There's nobody that's essentially come close. There's 5 times where a player has thrown for over 3,000 yards. Cam Rising is one of them. Tyler Huntley is one of them. Mike McCoy is 2 of them. And I obviously said Scott Mitchell with the 4,300 yards. So Alex Smith was just barely short of that. He was, I believe, 20 yards or something like that short. This is just not a number that Utah is used to getting, right? I know there's a lot of quarterbacks out there where 4,000 yards doesn't seem too unattainable because that's what their offense is. This offense is a little bit different. Will Cam throw for over 3,500 yards? I posed that on Twitter and asked kind of what people thought, and there's a lot of people going over 3,000, a lot of people even getting into that 4,000 range. I'm not saying it's not out of the realm of possibility, but I think there has to be so much that goes in Utah's favor for that to be possible, right? If Utah is able to be this electric offense that many expect them to be, maybe that's there, right? I think at the very least, your baseline has to be 3,000 yards. If Cam can get to 3,000 yards, I think Utah's going to be fine. I think they expect to have more than that, and so 3,500 yards to me feels kind of like that baseline, which sounds crazy considering that only 2 QBs at Utah have done it, but I think looking at who Utah has in that room, I think you can be optimistic about that. Barring him getting injured or whatever, we're not going to go that route. But I think that becomes a number that is obtainable, but it's not going to be easy by any means. But I'm curious to see if he can get there. Another area is 30 touchdowns too low? Looking at that again, like I said, Cam got, 26 touchdowns in 2022. So he was close. 30 touchdowns, only 2 quarterbacks, once again, in history have gotten over 30 touchdowns. And that was Scott Mitchell in 1989 with 31, and Alex Smith in 2004 with 32 touchdowns. Smith holds the record for that, in case you forgot. But 6 times in Utah history has a quarterback only thrown over 25 touchdowns. So, and Scott Mitchell did that twice. So looking at that, these are just not numbers that have been super high for Utah. I have a tendency to believe that could change this year. If Cam can get 26 touchdowns in 2022, there's a good likelihood that he could get to 30 this year. I don't know. These are some numbers that I'm just kind of throwing out there. I don't know that I have an opinion on it. I think it's going to be tough, but I don't think they're out of a goals standpoint, right? Like it's a reaching goal and something you want to get there. On the same side, this isn't Cam specific, but it is. Will there be a 1,000-yard receiver in Utah? I know this is the thing that Utah fans want so badly. Like this is something that they've desperately wanted to have a 1,000-yard receiver. And I get it. There's programs out there that seemingly churn out 1,000-yard receivers every single year. It's not a problem for them. But at Utah, if you can get a 1,000-yard receiver, that feels like a much bigger accomplishment than anything else, right? Utah can get a 1,000-yard rusher pretty easily, but getting that 1,000-yard receiver has been pretty tough. Only 7 receivers in Utah history have done it. The last was Drez Anderson in 2013, 1,002. He beat it by 2 yards. Still good enough, right? But even then, the highest is David Reed in 2009 at almost 1,200 yards, 1,188. He was the highest. Darren Carrington, everybody thought he was going to be that guy, right? And he, by all accounts, he should have. I think there was a lot of things that they probably could have done to get him there, but he finished with 980. This has not been an easy situation. But do you have somebody like a Dorian Singer? Is it somebody like Brant Keithy? Is it somebody else that maybe we're not even talking about right now? Maybe a Damian Alford or a Money Parks or somebody else that can be that 1,000-yard receiver? To me, I think because there's so much talent on the field, I don't know that Utah's going to get that 1,000-yard receiver. But if there is a 1,000-yard receiver, it has to be probably Dorian Singer. To me, he feels kind of like that electric guy where he's just going to do everything for Utah. As long as he's open, and they're going to have to worry, teams are going to have to worry about those underneath routes with the tight ends and, a bigger body guy like a Damian Alford or some of these other guys. That potentially becomes a great opportunity for Dorian to kind of make his hay and kind of do what he needs to. So those are some interesting numbers related to Cam. I don't know, if those are obtainable, but I think those are kind of some that I'm going to be watching for this season, right? Can you get to 3,500 passing yards? Can you get 30 touchdowns? Will Utah have a 1,000-yard receiver? If Utah can get all 3 of those, yeah, I have to imagine that Utah's in that Big 12 championship. Everything's going well for them, and things are kind of humming along in a way that works for Utah. So not necessarily things that Utah has to have by all means, but I think if you do approach those and you get to that area, that says a lot of what this team could be. So we'll leave it at that. We'll see how Cam looks next week. I think everybody's excited about that. They're excited to hear Bad Moon Rising playing in Rice-Eccles Stadium. I have a feeling that will be pretty electric. Because this is a Thursday night game, you'd have to imagine that fans will be in their seats early. Unlike a lot of FCS games, which happen like on a Saturday afternoon, this has potential to be able to be an electric environment. Fans really want those night games. I hear it all the time. As a media member, I like them a little earlier just to save my sleep schedule. But there's nothing like a night game, and so I think there's going to be a fun environment at Rice-Eccles Stadium, and once that goes over the PA system, I think fans are going to be pretty excited. So let's jump into the running back situation, and I've talked about this a bit, but I wanted to get some Quinton Ganther audio. I wanted to kind of get in there and kind of look at some of the situations there. So, Quinton, early on in fall camp, he wasn't easy to please with this. We asked him if he felt optimistic, and he was anything but. Not because he doesn't feel like there's not talent in the room, but I think he just expects a lot out of these players, and he wants them to produce at a high level, right? And so if they're not buying in his way, there's just not a lot of optimism, right? I think he wants them to buy in the way that he wants them to buy in. He wants them to produce the way that he thinks they should produce. And if they're able to do that, then there's going to be optimism. Kyle Whittingham already talked about there kind of being a tiered system. You have, Mekhi Bernard, Jalen Glover, and Mike Mitchell as expected to be that upper echelon group, right? Those three backs that are expected to really kind of take over and be the guys that they rely on most. Maybe one of those separates, maybe they don't. But I kind of wanted to get some of that conversation going with Quinton. So you'll hear from me and Steve Bartle in this clip that I'm going to play. But he's talking about that group, but how there may potentially be some other players in the list that are going to kind of really get some love.
Kyle had kind of talked about it as a tiered system in certain respects, where you got Mekhi, Jalen, and Mike. Do you see those three as kind of your main guys? Do you see any separation among them?
Well, those three are the main guys until they're not, because I'm going to tell you, we have a guy that's electric in that room. And when he touches the ball, he moves on a different playing field than everyone else, and that's Dejon Stanley. So he is making strides, whereas he's going to have to force our hand to, play him and use his skill set.
Can he play typical running back's position here in this offense?
I think he can. I mean, he is a little slight, but his body composition is a little different. He's stout. His body's a little different, and he's tough as all get out. So he'll throw it in there for sure.
So you get those three guys, obviously, and we'll talk a little bit more of that, but he's seeing a lot of expectations coming out of Dejon Stanley, right? Like he said, he's a smaller framed guy. He's not going to weigh as much. I think he's maybe pushing 170, 175, if I remember right. So he's going to be on the smaller end, but he's considered one of the fastest in the room or on the team even. If he can get some open space, watch him go, because he's gone, essentially. So I'm curious to see how they utilize him. Are they going to use him in sweeps? Are they going to use him, how are they going to use him in the backfield? Are they going to line him up occasionally in the slot? What are they going to do to give him the opportunities to be able to get that open space and really kind of own up to it? Because, everybody has talked about it. Everybody has said, you give him a little bit of sunlight and he's gone. So I want to see it, right? He's going to be on special teams, my understanding. He's going to be able to go out there and potentially be that Britton Covey type player where if you give him space, he's gone. But what's that mean for this room, right? If you've got these bruising backs that are going to come in there and they have the ability to kind of be more of your every down backs, what does that mean for him? So you will get those three. You will get Dejon Stanley. I'm curious to see how they mix him in. And so that's one of the questions that I want to see. But, there's been a lot of talk about, should Utah have that every down back, that bell cow back, as everybody likes to call it, or do they like the running back by committee? I asked Quint on that, right? Like I asked, do you like that? And here's his response, because I wanted to kind of get his take on it as a running back coach, because sometimes, you've heard in the past where they say, no, I want that guy. I want that guy to be able to be, if we feed the ball to him, we do that. His take was a little bit interesting, and it's probably the most honest take that you can get in this situation.
Do you like having a bunch of running backs like that, where you just could be mix and match in so many areas, or do you prefer to kind of more of similar guys?
Man, how this game is transitioning to now, this is not like football from 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's not a single team across the country that only use one guy. I mean, you have Ohio State that just paid two of their guys $1 million apiece. So you think those two guys are going to get paid $1 million and they don't play? Like, they're going to play. Like, you have to have guys that's able to do multiple things. And, this is a position that you take a lot of hits. So you have to have guys that's ready to go, because I don't want to drop off. If somebody goes down, I don't want to be like, oh, my goodness, what are we going to do now? No, the next man up, he might be more productive than the guy that was playing ahead of him.
First off, my favorite thing about Quinton is he loves to drop in the NIL stuff in there. He wants to talk about how much players are getting paid and how hard it is to bring running backs in with the NIL era. But, bringing in those Ohio State numbers is kind of fun to me. So, still kind of fun with that. With that, I think you get the true sense of where he's at. I don't think he cares necessarily of who is the starter and who's filling in, does it matter? No, I don't think so. I think it really is, he wants consistency, right? If Mekhi Bernard is your starter and you've got Jalen Glover and Mike Mitchell as what we'll call backups, is there a drop-off, right? Are you getting a level of drop-off where you say, no, you can't be on the field because you can't compete at that level? Also, as he mentioned, you need to be a well-rounded back. You've got to be able to pass protect. You've got to be able to catch in the backfield. You've got to be able to pick up, or you should have that vision where you know where to go. Those types of things that go beyond just, I'm going to take this ball and run it up the middle, or, run it off the edge, or whatever it may be. There's a lot of complexity to this, and he wants there to not be a drop-off. So if there's 5 players that do that, they're not going to play 5 players consistently, right? I'm not saying that. But you get the point of, if they can have that many players with little drop-off, that's what they care about, right? They want that consistency. When injuries start to pile up, when the games, in Utah's case, they hope that they can get up early and you get some other guys. I don't think you're as worried about the drop-off if you're up by a bunch of scores, but still you want to be able to have that sense of accomplishment where you feel like you can have consistency from 1 to 3 to 4 to 5. They feel like they have that. It's just a matter of how those reps are going to be divvied up. I don't think it's going to matter. I think it's going to matter more on, who the tight ends are, who the receivers are, who the running back is. All of that will be made up into what the play that Andy Ludwig wants to run. So it'll be fun. I think there's going to be a lot of mix and matching here. I don't know that there's going to be a standout starting running back for Utah. There's been a lot of praise about Mike Mitchell and how he can be that guy, and if anybody can, I think he can, if he can take the right necessary steps to be able to be in the game and work towards that. But when those bright lights come on, you see a different guy, right? I think at that position more than anything else, you generally see a guy that steps up. He likes the physicality. He wants to be able to be in there and mix it up with other players. And we may be surprised, right? Maybe it is somebody. Maybe Dijon Stanley, even though he's got a slider frame, maybe he is that guy that really takes hold. I'm not projecting that, but I think you'll see a lot of differences there, and I think it's a lot of fun. I think this is a running back room that can be dynamic and give Utah a lot of different looks that they want to do, especially with a lot of looks that they have in the tight end room and in the wide receiver room. So it'll be fun there. Speaking about tight ends, let's jump to that. Tight end play, they feel very confident in at least 6 tight ends where they feel like they can be starting caliber players, right? They still have to have that buy-in. They still have to work. There's just not going to be a lot of reps for all these guys, right? Like, you can only get so many reps. And so I'm going to play a clip from Andy kind of talking about that, on just kind of how difficult this situation is going to be, knowing that you have a lot of talented tight ends.
How do you manage 6 tight ends in terms of getting them on the field and making sure that they're involved?
Well, their skill set and ability has to warrant them, so that will kind of take care of itself. But as we talk about in the offensive staff room, every play we put together is a personnel meeting. There's no 2 players alike tight ends. There's a variety of skill set and strengths in that. It's just saying, hey, Brant Keithy's going to be a hard guy to take off the field, but maybe there's something that we would rather have Brant at the Y and Caleb Lohner at the second tight end, or vice. It's just mixing and matching those skill sets, but it will not be, hey, we got to keep 6 guys. Somebody's going. The depth and the skill that we're seeing on the roster and on the practice field, not everybody's going to be happy. There's only 1 ball. Last time I checked, there's 1 ball. So just keep working.
Just keep working. You got to keep going for that. And There's a lot of these guys that can mix it up and do different things. Some guys are going to be better in the pass protection, let's say, or there's some guys that are better route runners, some guys better pass catchers. There's just a lot of different assets that Utah can utilize here. Talking to Freddie Whittingham and kind of the positions and the individual players, he's talked about, maybe if you're in that 12 personnel where you're getting those 2 tight ends in, that's going to present a different look. And then you get the 13, maybe even 14 personnel. You're going to get a lot of these different looks that come in there. But he said that the biggest thing that Utah has to do as part of this, when you've got this many talented receivers, is not tipping your hand. Essentially, you're doing. He said you're doing some self scouting to not form tendencies. It's not okay. We know Brant Keithy's out and Caleb Lohner is lining up. Now we know this is going to be this play. Oh, this time it's Dallin Bentley, and this time it's Miki Sukarataga. This is what this play is going to be. They have to be creative that way and still utilize them in a way that is going to keep people guessing, right? If you have an understanding of what that tight end is going to do, that changes it a lot. And I know that, a lot of people talk about this, that tight end becomes a huge X factor in an offense. You obviously have your deep threat guys. You've got guys in the slot. You've got guys maybe that catch in the backfield. Those guys, you can mix and match, and you've got the route running, and it's all about, how you run those routes and the timing, all that other stuff. And it's not to say that isn't a tight end position as well, but they just provide such a wrinkle to an offense that really changes the dynamic of that. And if you have those tendencies, especially at that position, that changes a lot for how that offense is going to look. Utah has done a really good job of changing up their schemes and changing up kind of their calls and different things that way, so they don't generally get into that situation where you have another team that can scout them pretty easily. Last year when there was talk of all these, sign stealing and all this other stuff, Kyle Whittingham talked about if you're letting other teams get it in an easy way, that's on you, right? And I think that's very similar in this situation. If you're letting teams understand your tendencies, that's on you. That's not to say that there's not going to be some things there that will be, easy or hard or whatever that may be. Like it's not going to always be a one-to-one thing where that they're going to do this, but it might, right? And that might be fine with them. They might say, okay, we're okay with that because we know we can execute it well. We know we have Caleb Lohner out there who is just taller than anybody else, and none of these DBs or any of these linebackers are going to be able to stop him, right? And so maybe there is some scenarios where it is that way that it works. But, this position group of all the position groups has me really fascinated. I'm really curious to see how do they utilize them. You're obviously, like you said, going to use Brant Keithy, but because you have so much talent, maybe you can put some other guys in spots that kind of offload some of what he's got, right? It's not, we know it's going to Brant Keithy every time. It's, okay, it probably is going to go to Brant Keithy pretty regularly, but maybe there's some other guys that'll fit in there. Caleb Lohner keeps getting thrown out there as a guy that Utah has been pretty optimistic about. This is something that we're all kind of curious to see how that works, but it seems like he's making the right strides, right? I don't think he's going to go out there and have this perfect understanding of the offense and really be this huge playmaker from the beginning, but there's potential. He's working hard. He's got a physicality as well as just shiftiness as a basketball player that is kind of unmatched in a lot of ways. You don't see a lot of players that have that skill set. So for somebody with a bigger body like his, that changes. So once again, the whole tight end group as a whole, I'm really curious about. But how you mix in Caleb Lohner in there and what he's able to do is probably the most intriguing asset of that to me. So we're going to wrap up here soon, but I want to get into the defensive ends. I wrote a story about this. I posted it yesterday, talking about just how much talent Utah has in the defensive end room. They went into the transfer portal and got a ton more. It's a position group that they seemingly didn't really need to get more, and yet they did. I think there was expectations that Logan Fano probably wouldn't have been as healthy as he is. He's been able to get in there and do everything he needs to be able to get starting reps, and they'll limit him a little bit. They don't want to push him too hard, even though that he is, they say 100% healthy or close to 100%. You have at least guys behind him or in front of him that can do the job, right? So if you put in Logan, you're going to be okay. But talking to Lewis Powell, this is a position group, and you could put in the interior defensive linemen as well in this group. I didn't get a chance to talk to Luther Ellis about that, but this is two position groups to make up the entire defensive line that is incredibly deep. But this, I want you to hear what he says, because I think it's really fascinating to see how he is approaching this, knowing that you do have that much talent.
So you have a pretty stacked room. I know we talked about this a lot, but how are you getting reps, and how are you feeling that comfort knowing that you've got that much talent?
Man, it's good, but at the same time, it's kind of sad, because at some point we're going to have to divide the guys and say, hey, you guys are going to scout team, and you guys are going to be the tribal guys. And unfortunately, we got some guys that's going to go to scout team that probably start at any other university. We have a really good group, and the competition's still really alive right now, and I'm excited. We got the 3 veterans that's had some snaps with Connor O'Toole, and Van had almost 1,500 reps throughout his career, and you could tell he's grown up a lot this year, and he's one of our very better leaders. And the bottom tier, right, was really good with Cash coming in. He was a huge surprise, doing really well. Kip O'Connor, John Henry Daly, all those guys, Really Taufato'Fua, all of them did well this camp. And like I said, man, all those guys can play at a high level, and I feel bad because I can't play all of them, And scout team's going to have some guys that can start at any other university, and it's going to be probably the best scout defensive line group we've had here in a long time. But there's a good understanding, and those guys all understand and respect the process, and they just got to continue to put their head down and work, because they're fresh. John Henry's a freshman. He has, so many years ahead of him, and he's a really good player. But, right now we have a good group of 3 leaders with Logan, Connor, and Van, and those guys have been leading the crew. And Paul Fitzgerald and Cash Dillon and all those guys have shown up and did really well.
You can kind of see how conflicted a little bit they are with this group, right? I mean, it's not like they're going to be like, oh, should we play this guy? No, they know who they're going to play. But I think it's the fact that you have so much talent out there, and you want to be able to get them on the field. You want to make them happy. In this age of the transfer portal, it's not that guys won't stay. I think they'll stay if they feel like they're progressing and they're doing what they need to. But you want to be able to give them some sense of hope, right? And putting guys that, like you said, could start at other universities, and some have. Let's say like a Paul Fitzgerald at Utah State. That's not an easy thing to say, hey, I'm going to go put you on the scout team even though you were starting at another school last year. At the same time, you have to see the trajectory of a lot of these players, right? A lot of these guys are going to the league. They're getting opportunities. If you wait one more year, can you get there, right? A lot of these guys are veteran guys. Connor O'Toole, Van Fillinger, Logan Fano's still young in the system, but, maybe he could make a run at the NFL. Maybe those positions open up and you have that next year. And if you've been in that system and you've learned from these guys ahead of you, how much further along you can be. So there's a lot of that, and I don't want to get too much into that because it doesn't really merit it. That's just how football is played. But I think you're seeing Utah loaded up in the defensive line group. They brought in a ton of talent. They have a lot of returning talent. And so they feel very confident with where they're at. And that bodes well for next year, right? And the years after, where Utah is going to continually churn out guys. But there may be some of these guys that are hidden, right? They might be barely on the travel squad, and they're going to come, and most of the time they're going to sit on the bench. But I think you're going to have some of these guys that like you mentioned, that are starting caliber players that are going to probably be on the scout team. So by and large, though, I think this is where Utah has to go as a program, right? Forever, Kyle Whittingham had talked about once, I said recruiting, but it's more developing that depth. The biggest issue that Utah faced early on in the Pac-12 was they had good enough talent at their frontline guys to be able to at least compete, right? That doesn't mean that they were going to be better than a lot of those teams that they were going up against, but they had talent to compete. And knowing the way that Coach Whittingham coaches, and the ways that he's been able to get the most out of players. They were able to be in these games because of kind of that quote unquote coach effect, right? That they were able to be coached to a point where they could, win one for the Gipper, so to speak. But now it's shifted over these last few years, especially where Utah has done a really good job of developing talent, but now adding the depth behind them so that when that talent leaves, it's much easier to replace them. You see a school like Georgia or Ohio State or Alabama, that's how they're so successful, is they're finding ways to kind of stack those classes, right? You're stacking talent so that when you do lose those guys, hopefully to the NFL, that's what every team wants, they have talent behind them that it's not a huge drop-off. It's not that you come into that 2025 season and you're super worried about who you have. Maybe you're worried because they don't have that experience, but you're optimistic because they've been able to learn from the guys ahead of them, and they do that. Depth has always been a thing, right? It's not like Utah suddenly got depth, more so than they have in years past. I mean, yes, this year they do have more top-tier depth, but there's always depth. It's a matter of just being able to stack it in a way where you're getting those high-level guys, right? That they know that, okay, next year can be my chance. And if it's not, maybe that's where the transfer portal problem comes, but this is a great situation for Utah to have. You're getting a good reputation where a guy like a Paul Fitzgerald leaves Utah State to come to Utah and may not even get a shot to play any games this year. I don't believe that'll be the case, but maybe. You got a John Henry Daly who looks at his situation at BYU and says, you know what? Yeah, I could have probably gotten into a situation where I got some extended playing time this next year, but I'm going to go to Utah where I might be on the scout team. I don't think guys go into the system expecting to be on the scout team, but they're coming in because they understand the reputation of what that can be. And that's the way that Utah's managed it. I'm not here to hype them up or do anything that way, but I think that's just how they've done it, especially on the defensive line. And it's paid dividends. So that's kind of where that's at. Last thing that I want to talk about, just kind of when we talk to coaches, there was a lot of conversations about the defensive backs, the corners and nickel essentially for Sharif Shah's room, right? This is a group that does have talent, and there's guys that they feel really confident in, but it's getting to that next level, that experience and how to get a guy. I wrote a story, I think it was last week, about how Utah develops these players, and it's really fascinating to hear Shah talk about this because he's excuse me. He's really tough about this. He's not going to give these guys an inch and as he says, clap them up because they did one good thing. He's pushing them to become better, right? It's you did that great, but now let's move on because you're still not doing X, Y, Z. Jalen Johnson, that's kind of a tough transition that I just went to, but Jalen Johnson obviously is one of those guys that was an incredibly driven guy when he came into that room. He told Sharif Shah exactly what he wanted to do. He went out there and performed it. Clark Phillips is a very similar guy who went out there very, very similarly to Jalen Johnson, and they had the same work ethic. You're now seeing that pay off in the NFL. Jalen, had a huge contract this year. Clark is going to get to that point, and as if he continues to progress, you're going to have that. I asked Sharif kind of, do you talk about these players? Like, is that something you bring up? Not just for, hey, we've got these guys that are in the NFL, but like, how do you use them to talk about getting the most out of players? And I loved his response, and so I'm going to play that right now for you because I think it kind of shows, actually, I'm going to show what that is because I think it's a pretty great setting for what he's able to kind of show how Utah works.
Another player that followed a similar path in terms of going through his recruitment and actually doing the work and studying was Jalen Johnson. Right. It seems like he's blossoming in Chicago. Like, what's that meant to you to see that from him?
Oh, man. It gets me emotional. When he called me and told me, he said, I told you I was going to do exactly what I said I was going to do. That's what he said. The first thing, I mean, I'd already read that he'd signed for like $76 million or something like that, but he told me when I recruited him in his house, I sat in his living room, he said, Coach, if I come to Utah, I'll leave in 3 years. I'll be an All-American. I'm going to be a high draft pick. And then my second contract, I'll sign for like $70 million. If it didn't all come true, and it was toil through that process. It was pain, surgeries, dealing with the ups and downs of being a freshman in a very difficult program, having to sit out a spring, I mean, it was a lot, but everything he said came to pass. And he said, Coach, thank you for loving and believing in me when I forgot to love and believe in myself. It makes you emotional. I'm so proud of that. I'm so proud of him and the man that he's become. So it warms my heart.
A guy like Jalen obviously was pretty self-motivated, but how much do you rely on going back to that to teach some of these younger players and what that work ethic takes here at Utah?
It is brought up every day. I tell them, they're like, Coach, I want to be like him. And all these people, they see it on the wall in the room. I'm like, really? You really want to be like him? Well, then don't leave after practice, because he stayed every single day. Every day he stayed for 3 years. And he would work with me, then work with a young player, then work by himself. That was his routine. He said, Coach, I can't do everything I need with everybody. So you need to spend some time with me. I need to spend some time with the younger kids, and then I need to be by myself. I said, so if you really want to be like him, then the level of work, your work ethic has to increase exponentially, because his knew no limits. What he would do in order to become great, what he believed was just, it was immeasurable. And I loved it, and it was consistent every day. Cold, hot, it made no difference. I saw him, whether we're in the indoor, working on his hands, working on his feet. Coach, give me a couple of reps where I can press bell in some awkward angle. I said, baby, you're not going to have to do that. He goes, maybe. I just want to know that my body can do that. I said, all right, let's try it. And it sure is certain those contorted movements showed up. And I see them in the league when he's playing folks. I said, wow. So that's what his name is brought up constantly. Yeah.
So yeah, that's pretty incredible, right? Like, you have these guys that are coming in there and they are working tremendously hard. They're putting in those hours. You know, as somebody that gets to see that part of camp where or after practice even, where guys are staying after, they're working on their craft. Sharif is absolutely one of those guys that will stay there if you ask him, right? And he's always one of the last coaches off the field, because there's at least one player, that is wanting his attention. Jalen was always that guy. You know, Clark was always that guy. There's other guys. Zamaya is doing that same thing as somebody that's working hard. Maybe not to that same level, but he's still kind of getting in there and kind of seeing how important it is to have those extra reps and to kind of learn those different things. So, I think Utah's in good hands with somebody like Sharif. He's going to hold these guys accountable, but they also recruit guys that are very self-motivated, and they want to be in there, and they want to kind of put themselves in a position that's going to be effective, and so they understand what's happening. That's why Utah leads the nation in pick sixes consecutive years, right? They study that film. They've put themselves in a situation to understand it, so that when you do get on the field, you're not presented with a case like, I don't know how to catch the ball this way, or I've seen the film, I know that he's going to break this way, and now I can jump ahead of the route and, you know, get the ball and go for a pick six. It's those types of things that has helped this room become so successful. Yes, it's Sharif, and 100% it's him. He's a guy that inspires anybody. I think anybody that listens to him for 5 minutes will run through a wall for him. But he's now adding on top of that guys that are incredibly motivated. They're incredibly driven people that, yes, the league is where they want to be, but there's more, right? They want to be the best in their craft in college. And if you're not there, you're never going to see it in the league. So it's kind of fun. It's kind of fun to watch how that all shapes up and how it's going to be. But, yeah, it's this is where Utah's at, and I think it's going to be a fun season to watch. I think there's a lot of talent on both sides of the ball, and we're close. So we're going to wrap that up now. I've talked long enough, and if you've managed to last this long, kudos to you. There's a lot to talk about, and we'll break a lot of these things down. But I hope that I can give you some information that maybe you haven't heard, especially with this audio. And keep going with that. But we'll eventually transition probably to 2 podcasts a week, breaking down the game that happened, as well as looking ahead to the game that will take place. So we'll get into that, but football's close. Go enjoy those week 0 games, this week, and then know that you're in game week. Once that Monday press conference shows up for Kyle Whittingham, you only have a few more sleeps before you get Utah football back. So with that, I'm signing off. Have a wonderful day, and we will chat again next time.